The autumn wind cut through Margaret's thin jacket as she hurried down Maple Street. Her lunch break was almost over, and she still hadn't eaten the sandwich sitting in her bag. Working as a hospital administrator meant days like this were normal. Meetings ran long, emergencies popped up, and personal time became a luxury she couldn't afford. She was about to turn the corner toward her usual bench when she heard it. Piano music. Not the recorded kind that played in elevators or coffee shops, but real music. Someone was actually playing, and they were good, really good. Margaret stopped walking. Her feet seemed to root themselves to the sidewalk. The music was coming from the old community center, the brick building she passed every day without a second thought. Today was different. Today the windows were open, and the sound of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata drifted out into the street. Without thinking, her right hand lifted slightly. Her fingers moved in the air, pressing invisible keys. It was an old habit, one she thought she'd buried decades ago. But music had a way of bringing back memories, whether she wanted them or not. A small crowd had gathered near the entrance. Maybe 15 or 20 people, all pressed close to the glass doors, trying to catch a glimpse inside. Margaret found herself walking toward them, drawn by something she couldn't quite name. She stood at the back on her toes, trying to see over shoulders and between heads. Through the doorway she could make out a grand piano, black and glossy, the kind that cost more than she made in a year, and at the bench sat a man, his back straight, his hands moving across the keys with the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of practice and praise. "That's David Morrison." A woman next to her whispered to her friend. "You know, the pianist. He's been on television and everything." "What's he doing here?" The friend whispered back. "Charity gala next week. He's the main performer." Guess he needed a place to practice. Margaret watched his hands. Even from this distance she could see the precision in every movement. No wasted motion. No hesitation. He played like someone who had never doubted his place at a piano, never questioned whether he deserved to make music. She felt something twist in her chest. Not jealousy exactly. Maybe longing. Maybe regret. It was hard to tell after all these years. The music built to its crescendo and then softened, ending on a note so gentle it seemed to hang in the air. For a moment nobody moved. Then the small crowd burst into applause. Some people called out compliments. Others just smiled and nodded to each other before walking away, back to their lunch breaks and errands. Margaret stayed. She didn't clap. She just stood there, her fingers still moving slightly at her sides, playing along to music that had already ended. Inside, David stood from the bench and stretched. He rolled his shoulders and shook out his hands. Then he looked up and saw her through the glass. Their eyes met for just a second. Margaret smiled, a small polite smile, the kind you give strangers. Then she started to turn away, but he was already walking toward the door. She heard it open behind her. "Excuse me?" Margaret turned back. Up close, David Morrison looked exactly like his pictures. Tall, well-dressed, with gray hair that somehow made him look distinguished rather than old. His clothes were expensive. His watch probably cost more than her car. "Yes?" she said. "Were you enjoying the music?" His tone was friendly enough, but there was something underneath it. Something that made her feel small. "I was," she said simply. "That's wonderful." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I always think it's important for everyone to appreciate classical music. Even if you don't really understand what's happening technically, you can still enjoy the beauty of it, you know?" Margaret felt her smile freeze on her face. "Even if you don't understand." The words hung between them like a wall. She looked down at herself, seeing what he must see. A middle-aged woman in a cheap jacket and worn shoes. Hands that looked like they did paperwork, not art. Hair pulled back in a simple ponytail because she didn't have time for anything else. To him, she must look like someone who had never touched a piano, never read a sheet of music, never felt the weight of keys under her fingers. "I see," she said quietly. "There are some wonderful beginner classes here at the community center," he continued, warming to his subject. "If you're interested in learning more about music, never too late to start, right?" Something in her wanted to speak up, to tell him she didn't need beginner classes, to explain that she knew exactly what he'd done in the third movement, where he'd added his own interpretation, where his technique was flawless, and where it was just slightly rushed. But she didn't. "That's kind of you," she said instead. "I should get back to work." Of course, of course." He gave her another smile, the kind people give when they think they've done their good deed for the day. "Enjoy your afternoon." He went back inside, Through the glass, she watched him return to the piano, settling onto the bench like he belonged there, like he'd always belonged there. Margaret walked away, her sandwich still uneaten in her bag. The music started again behind her, but this time she didn't stop. She didn't let her fingers move. She just walked, her eyes fixed straight ahead, but inside something had shifted. A door she'd kept locked for 30 years had cracked open just a little, and through that crack old feelings were starting to leak out, feelings she'd worked very hard to bury. That evening, after her shift ended and she'd made dinner and cleaned the kitchen, Margaret found herself standing in front of her bedroom closet. At the back, behind winter coats and old blankets, was a cardboard box. She hadn't opened it in years, hadn't wanted to. She pulled it out now, setting it on her bed. The tape had yellowed with age. Inside were things she'd packed away when she was 19 years old. Sheet music, its edges soft from handling, competition programs with her name printed in them, newspaper clippings, the paper thin enough to see through, a silver medal on a faded ribbon. At the very bottom was a photograph. Her at 17 sitting at a piano. She was mid-performance, her eyes closed, her whole body focused on the music. She looked so young, so sure of herself, so certain that this was her future. Margaret picked up the photograph and sat on the edge of her bed, holding it in both hands. In the picture, she couldn't see what was coming. The phone call. Her father's slurred words. The hospital. The bills. The choice that wasn't really a choice at all. She set the photograph down and closed the box. But she didn't put it back in the closet. Instead, she left it on her bed, lid open, contents visible. Outside her window, the sun was setting. Somewhere across town, David Morrison was probably playing for friends at some dinner party, accepting compliments, taking for granted a life lived in music, and Margaret sat alone in her small bedroom, looking at remnants of a dream that had died so long ago she'd almost convinced herself it had never existed at all. Almost. Margaret couldn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. The box from her closet sat on her dresser now, still open. Even in the dark, she could feel its presence. At 2 a.m, she gave up on sleep. She got up, made tea, and sat at her small kitchen table. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. It was the kind of silence that made memories loud. She thought about the first time she'd ever touched a piano. She was 7 years old, and her elementary school had one in the corner of the music room. It was old and out of tune, with keys that stuck when you pressed them. But to her, it had been magic. The music teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had noticed her standing by the piano during recess while other kids played outside. "Want to try?" she'd asked. Margaret had nodded, too shy to speak. Mrs. Patterson had shown her middle C, and Margaret had pressed it, feeling the vibration travel up her finger and into her chest. That was all it took. One note and she was hooked. Her parents couldn't afford a piano. Her father worked at a factory and her mother cleaned houses. They had 3 kids and bills that never seemed to stop coming. But when Mrs. Patterson called them in for a meeting, when she told them their daughter had something special, they found a way. They bought a used upright piano from a church that was closing down. It cost $800 they didn't have. Her father took extra shifts. Her mother started cleaning an additional house on weekends, and Margaret got her piano. She practiced every day after school, 1 hour, then 2, then 3. Her fingers grew calluses. Her back ached from sitting too long. But she didn't care. When she played, everything else disappeared. The cramped apartment, the sound of her parents arguing about money, the way her older brother teased her for being different. None of it mattered when she was at the piano. By the time she was 12, Mrs. Patterson said she'd taught her everything she could. Margaret needed a real teacher, someone who understood advanced technique and competition preparation. That's when they found Professor Hendricks. Margaret remembered the first lesson like it was yesterday. Professor Hendricks lived in a nice part of town, the kind where houses had front yards and 2-car garages. His music room had a grand piano, the first one Margaret had ever played. She'd been terrified to touch it. "Go ahead," he'd said, watching her from a chair in the corner. "Let me hear what you can do." She'd played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Her hands had shaken for the first few measures, but then the music took over. When she finished, the room was silent. She'd looked up at Professor Hendricks, afraid of what he might say. He'd been wiping his eyes. "How old are you, child?" 12. "And who taught you to play like that?" "Mrs. Patterson at school." He'd shaken his head slowly. "You have a gift. A real gift, and we're going to make sure you use it." The lessons were expensive. $200 a month, which might as well have been $2 million for her family. But Professor Hendricks cut his rate in half, and her parents somehow found the money. Every month. For 6 years, Margaret won her first competition at 13, a regional youth competition that came with a $500 prize. She'd given every penny to her parents. Her mother had cried, the wins kept coming. By 16, she'd won competitions across 3 states. Newspaper articles called her a prodigy. Music schools started sending letters, scholarship opportunities. Her future was bright and clear, like a path lit up in front of her. Professor Hendricks pushed her harder. They worked on the big pieces, the ones that could win national competitions. Rachmaninoff, Liszt, Prokofiev. Her fingers flew across keys, building strength and speed and precision. She practiced 6 hours a day, more on weekends. Her social life disappeared, but she didn't mind. She didn't need friends when she had music. She didn't need parties or boyfriends or the things other teenagers cared about. She had a purpose, a future, a dream that felt more real than anything else in her life. At 19, the acceptance letter came. A full scholarship to the conservatory. One of the best music schools in the country. 4 years of training with master teachers, performing in renowned concert halls, building a professional network. It was everything she'd worked for, everything her family had sacrificed for. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. On Wednesday, her father had a stroke. Margaret was at the kitchen table making plans for her move to the conservatory when her mother's phone rang. She'd answered it and her face had gone white. "We have to go to the hospital now." They'd found him at the factory, collapsed by his machine. The doctor said he was lucky to be alive, but the stroke had damaged his brain. His left side was paralyzed. His speech was slurred and slow. He would need months of rehabilitation, maybe years, and even then he might never work again. Margaret sat by his hospital bed holding his hand, the hand that had worked all those extra shifts to pay for her piano, the hand that had patted her shoulder after every performance, his eyes shining with pride even though he didn't understand classical music. "I'm sorry," he'd whispered, his words barely clear. "I'm sorry." "For what, Dad?" "Your school. The music school. We can't—" "The medical bills." "I'm sorry." That's when Margaret understood. The scholarship covered tuition, but not living expenses, not supplies and travel and all the other costs. And now, with her father unable to work, with medical bills piling up, with her younger sister and brother still in high school, there was no way her family could support her. She could defer for a year, maybe 2, but the scholarship had conditions. She had to maintain her skill level. She had to continue studying with a qualified teacher. She had to perform regularly. All things that required time and money they didn't have. She made the decision on a Thursday afternoon, sitting in the hospital cafeteria with coffee she wasn't drinking. She was the oldest. She was the one who could work. Her siblings were still in school. Her mother needed to take care of her father. It was simple math. Cold and clear and unavoidable. On Friday, she called the conservatory and declined the scholarship. On Monday, she started a data entry job at the hospital where her father was recovering. It paid $12 an hour. It wasn't music, but it paid the bills. Professor Hendricks had called her when he found out. "Margaret, you can't do this. Your talent, it's once in a generation. You can't throw it away." "I'm not throwing it away," she'd said, her voice flat. "I'm just putting it aside for a while. You know that's not how it works. If you stop now, if you take years off, you'll never get back to where you were. The competition, the other students, they're not waiting. Music doesn't wait, I know. Then why? Because they're my family." She'd said it simply, like it explained everything. Because it did. He'd been quiet for a long moment. "I understand. I wish I didn't, but I do. Just promise me something." "What?" "Don't stop playing completely, even if it's just for yourself." "Don't let the music die," she'd promised. But promises were easy to make and hard to keep. That first year, she played sometimes on her breaks at the hospital. There was an old piano in the chapel, and she'd sneak in when no one was around. But every time she sat down, every time her fingers touched the keys, it hurt. It reminded her of what she'd lost, what she'd given up, so she stopped going to the chapel. She stopped listening to classical music. She packed away her sheet music and her competition programs and her dreams. She told herself it was easier this way, that it was better not to think about it. Years passed. Her father recovered enough to do light work. Her sister graduated and got a job. Her brother went to community college. The family stabilized, but by then, Margaret had moved up at the hospital. She had responsibilities. She had a career, even if it wasn't the one she'd imagined, and the piano gathered dust in the corner of her mother's living room, untouched except when her niece came to visit and pecked out simple melodies with one finger. Now, sitting at her kitchen table at 2 a.m. with cold tea, Margaret let herself remember all of it, the good and the bad, the joy and the loss. For 30 years she'd kept it locked away, but David Morrison's condescending smile had picked the lock. She got up and went back to her bedroom. She opened the box on her dresser and pulled out a piece of sheet music. Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, one of the hardest pieces she'd ever mastered. The paper was yellowed, the edges soft. Her penciled notes were still there in the margins. Fingering reminders, dynamic markings, the handwriting of a 19-year-old girl who thought she knew exactly where her life was going. Margaret held the sheet music and made a decision. Not a big one, not a dramatic one, just a small decision that felt right. Tomorrow, on her lunch break, she would go back to the community center. She would ask if she could use one of their practice rooms. Just for an hour. Just to see if her hands still remembered. Just to see if the music was still there, waiting for her after all these years. The week passed slowly. Every day, Margaret thought about going to the community center. Every day she found an excuse not to. Too busy at work. Too tired. Maybe tomorrow. But on Friday, something changed. She was organizing a blood drive at the hospital, and the community center had volunteered their space. Margaret had to go there anyway. It felt like fate, though she didn't really believe in fate. She arrived early to set up, carrying boxes of supplies and clipboards. The main hall was perfect for the blood drive. Big, open with good lighting. But as she walked past the music room, she heard it again. Piano music, she shouldn't have stopped. She had work to do. But her feet carried her to the doorway anyway. David Morrison was there, practicing the same piece he'd been working on last week. He looked focused, intense. His fingers moved across the keys with the kind of ease that came from playing the same piece 100 times. Margaret stood watching for a moment, then turned to leave. She had chairs to arrange and tables to set up. Margaret, a voice called out behind her. She turned to see Linda Chen, the community center director. Linda was in her 60s with short gray hair and the kind of warm smile that made everyone feel welcome. She was walking toward Margaret with quick steps. I thought that was you, Linda said, slightly out of breath. I'm so glad you're here early. We need to talk about the setup for the blood drive. They spent the next 20 minutes going over details, where the beds would go, how many volunteers they'd have, what time everything should start. Professional talk, easy talk, the kind of conversation Margaret had every day. But then Linda lowered her voice and glanced toward the music room. That's David Morrison in there. He's performing at our charity gala next week. I know, Margaret said. I saw him practicing last week. Linda studied her face for a moment. Did you know we have a problem with the gala? What kind of problem? We need someone to play during intermission. Nothing fancy, just something nice while people mingle and have drinks. Our usual volunteer had to cancel. Her mother's in the hospital. Margaret nodded sympathetically, but she could feel where this conversation was going. Her chest tightened. I was looking through our old files, Linda continued, and I found something interesting, a newspaper clipping from 1992, about a young pianist who won the regional championship. She paused. It was you, wasn't it? Margaret felt her face grow warm. That was a long time ago. The article said you were going to the conservatory, that you had a full scholarship. Things changed, Margaret said simply. She didn't elaborate. She never did. Linda was quiet for a moment, respectful. I understand. Life doesn't always go the way we plan. She hesitated. But would you consider playing at the gala? Just for intermission, 15 or 20 minutes. Nothing too demanding. Margaret's hands started to sweat. Linda, I haven't played seriously in 30 years. I wouldn't even know where to start. You could practice here. We have 3 practice rooms. You could use them anytime free of charge. I don't think it's a good idea. Just think about it, Linda said gently. You don't have to decide right now. But before Margaret could respond, David Morrison emerged from the music room. He was checking his phone, not paying attention, and nearly walked right into them. Oh, excuse me, he said, looking up. His eyes moved from Linda to Margaret, and there was a flicker of recognition. Haven't I seen you before? Last week, Margaret said. Outside the music room. Right. He smiled, but it was the same smile as before. Polite but distant. Are you here for the blood drive? I'm organizing it, Margaret said. How wonderful. Community service is so important. He said it the way rich people often did, like charity was a hobby rather than a necessity. Linda jumped in. David, I was just telling Margaret about our intermission problem. I think she might be able to help us out. David raised his eyebrows. Oh, do you play? The question hung in the air. Margaret could feel her heart beating faster. She could say no. She could make an excuse and walk away. That would be the safe choice. The easy choice, a little, she said finally. A long time ago. David's expression shifted into something that looked like concern mixed with doubt. Well, that's very kind of you to offer, but the gala is a pretty high-profile event. We have donors coming from all over the state. The music needs to be, well, professional quality. Something in his tone made Margaret's jaw tighten. It was the same tone from last week. The assumption that she wasn't good enough, that she couldn't possibly measure up. I'm sure Margaret would be perfectly fine, Linda said, an edge in her voice. She's won competitions. David looked surprised. Competitions? What kind of competitions? Regional championships, Linda said. When she was younger. Oh, youth competitions. David's smile returned, warm and patronizing. Those are wonderful for building confidence. But playing at a gala is quite different from a student recital. There's pressure, there's an audience of sophisticated listeners. He turned to Margaret. No offense, but if you haven't played seriously in decades, you might be better off just enjoying the evening as a guest. Margaret felt something shift inside her. It was like a door slamming shut and a window flying open at the same time. All week she'd been afraid. Afraid her hands wouldn't remember. Afraid she'd lost whatever gift she'd once had. Afraid of the pain that would come from touching those keys again. But now, looking at David's confident face, his expensive suit, his complete certainty that she was beneath him, the fear transformed into something else, something sharper. What would I need to play? She asked Linda, her voice steady. Linda looked surprised but pleased. Whatever you're comfortable with. Like I said, just 15 or 20 minutes. Background music, really. David made a small sound, almost like a laugh. Linda, I really think we should find someone with more recent experience. Maybe one of the students from the music academy downtown. They'd be thrilled for the opportunity. I think Margaret can handle it, Linda said firmly.
Unless you have concerns about her sharing the stage with you?
It was a pointed question, and David's face reddened slightly. Of course not. I just want what's best for the gala. Then it's settled, Linda said, turning to Margaret. You'll play intermission. Come by this weekend and pick out whatever practice room you want. The gala is next Friday, so you'll have a full week to prepare. Margaret nodded slowly, not quite believing what she'd just agreed to. Okay, I'll do it. David opened his mouth like he wanted to say something else, then closed it. He checked his watch. I should go. I have a meeting across town. He nodded to both of them. Linda, Margaret, I'll see you at the gala. He walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. When he was gone, Linda let out a long breath. I'm sorry about that. He means well, but sometimes he can be a bit arrogant, Margaret supplied. Linda laughed. I was going to say particular, but yes, arrogant works too. She touched Margaret's arm gently. You don't have to do this if you don't want to. I shouldn't have put you on the spot like that. No, Margaret said. I want to do it. And as she said it, she realized it was true. For the first time in 30 years, she wanted to play. Not just to prove David wrong, though there was some of that, but for herself. To see if the music was still there. Good, Linda said, smiling. I'll make sure you have access to the best practice room. The one with the Steinway. Margaret helped finish setting up the blood drive, but her mind was somewhere else. It was thinking about music. About which pieces she could still play. About whether her fingers would remember what her brain had forgotten. That evening, she went home and pulled out all her old sheet music. She spread it across her bed. Piece after piece, memory after memory. Some of it was too advanced. She needed something she could polish in a week, not months. Her hand stopped on a familiar piece, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the first piece she'd ever played for Professor Hendricks. It was beautiful but not too showy, elegant but not too complicated, and she knew it by heart, or at least she had once. She picked up the sheet music and held it carefully like it might crumble in her hands. Then she made a decision. Tomorrow was Saturday. She would go to the community center early before David arrived for his practice session. She would sit at that Steinway piano, and she would see if 30 years was too long to be away from something you once loved. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. "Mom wants to know if you're coming for dinner Sunday," Margaret typed back. "Yes, and tell her I have something to tell her." She didn't say what. She wasn't ready to explain yet. Wasn't ready to see the hope in her mother's eyes or the questions from her siblings. First, she needed to know if she could still do this. She set her alarm for 6 in the morning. Then she sat on her bed, surrounded by sheet music and memories, and let herself feel something she hadn't felt in 3 decades: anticipation, nervousness, and underneath it all, a tiny spark of excitement. The piano was waiting. And for the first time in a very long time, so was she. Saturday morning came too early. Margaret's alarm went off at 6, and for a moment she considered turning it off and going back to sleep. Pretending she'd never agreed to play, pretending the whole thing was a mistake, but she got up anyway. She made coffee, took a shower, and dressed in comfortable clothes. Then she grabbed her old sheet music and drove to the community center. The parking lot was empty. The building was quiet. Linda had given her a key card the day before, and Margaret used it to let herself in. Her footsteps echoed in the empty hallways as she walked toward the practice rooms. Few measures were rough. She missed notes. Her timing was off. Her fingers stumbled over passages that used to be easy. But she kept going. And slowly, very slowly, something started to happen. The music came back, not all at once but in pieces. A phrase here, a section there. Her hands remembered things her mind had forgotten. The way to shape a melody, the way to voice a chord, the way to make the piano sing instead of just plain notes. By the end of the piece, she was crying. She didn't realize it until she finished and felt tears on her cheeks. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was something bigger than that. Relief, maybe. Or grief for all the years she'd lost. Or joy at finding something she thought was gone forever. She played the piece again. And again. Each time it got better. Each time more of the old feeling came back. She lost track of time. When she finally looked at her phone, it was almost noon. She'd been playing for 6 hours. Her hands ached. Her back hurt. But she felt more alive than she had in years. Over the next week, Margaret went to the community center every day. Early in the morning before work, during her lunch breaks, in the evenings after dinner. She practiced until her fingers were sore and her mind was exhausted. The Chopin was sounding good. Really good. But something was bothering her. The piece was beautiful, but it was safe. It was the kind of thing David expected from her. Pretty background music that wouldn't challenge anyone. On Wednesday evening, 3 days before the gala, Margaret pulled out a different piece of sheet music, Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, the piece that had won her the regional championship when she was 17. The piece that Professor Hendricks had called her signature work. It was much harder than the Chopin. Powerful and dramatic, with crushing chords and rapid passages that required strength and precision. It was the kind of piece that announced itself. That demanded attention. She hadn't played it in 30 years. Hadn't even looked at the music. But now, sitting in the practice room with 3 days until the gala, she thought about David's condescending smile. His certainty that she couldn't handle anything more than simple background music. She put the Rachmaninoff on the music stand and started to play. The first page was a disaster. Her hands couldn't handle the big chords. The fast passages were muddy and unclear. But she kept working, section by section, measure by measure. Her hands were stronger now after a week of practice. Her technique was coming back. By Thursday evening, she could play through the whole piece. It wasn't perfect. There were rough spots, places where her technique wasn't quite what it used to be. But the emotion was there. The power was there. And something else, too. Something she couldn't quite name. A depth that came from years of life lived, of dreams deferred, of sacrifice and survival. Friday arrived. The day of the gala, Margaret called in sick to work. She needed the day to rest her hands and calm her nerves. She tried to eat breakfast but couldn't. Her stomach was in knots. At 3 in the afternoon, she started getting ready. She didn't have fancy clothes, nothing appropriate for a gala, but she had a simple black dress that she wore to hospital fundraisers. It would have to do. She arrived at the community center at 6. The gala started at 7. The main hall had been transformed. Round tables with white tablecloths, flower arrangements, a small stage at one end with the grand piano. Linda found her immediately. "There you are. How are you feeling?" "Terrified," Margaret admitted. Linda squeezed her arm. "You're going to be wonderful. I heard you practicing this week. You sound amazing." People started arriving. Donors in expensive suits and cocktail dresses, local politicians, business owners, the kind of people who wrote big checks and expected to be impressed. At 7:30, David took the stage. The room fell silent. He sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and began to play. He was brilliant. Margaret had to admit that. His technique was flawless. Every note was perfect, every phrase shaped beautifully. The audience was mesmerized. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. People stood. They cheered. David took his bow with practiced grace, smiling at the crowd. "We'll take a short intermission," the master of ceremonies announced. "Please enjoy refreshments and we'll resume in 20 minutes. Margaret felt her heart racing. This was it. Her hands were sweating. Her legs felt weak. Linda appeared beside her. "You're on in 15 minutes. Do you need anything?" "Just a moment alone," Margaret said. She went to the practice room, the same room where she'd spent the last week. She sat at the Steinway and put her hands on the keys. But she didn't play. She just sat there, breathing, centering herself. She thought about her father, recovering in that hospital bed, apologizing for ruining her future. She thought about Professor Hendricks telling her that music doesn't wait. She thought about David Morrison's smile, so certain that she didn't belong on the same stage as him. And she thought about that 7-year-old girl who had pressed middle C for the first time and felt magic. At 7:55, Linda knocked on the door. "It's time." Margaret walked to the main hall. The crowd was mingling, drinking wine, talking in small groups. Most of them weren't paying attention. They expected background music, something pleasant and forgettable. She sat at the piano. The bench was still warm from David. She adjusted it slightly, positioning herself just right. She looked out at the crowd, saw David standing near the back, champagne glass in hand, talking to a man in an expensive suit. She placed her hands on the keys, and she made a decision. She wasn't going to play the Chopin. She was going to play Rachmaninoff. The room was still noisy, people talking and laughing. No one was watching her. That was fine. They would be. She started soft. The opening notes of the prelude, quiet and ominous. A few people near the front turned to look, but most of the crowd kept talking. Then came the famous chords, the ones that Rachmaninoff called the bells of Moscow, massive, powerful chords that filled the hall like thunder. The talking stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Margaret's hands flew across the keys. The fast passage in the middle section, the one that had always given her trouble, came out clear and precise. Her fingers were working on instinct now, on muscle memory built over years of practice decades ago. But it was more than just technique. She was pouring everything into this performance, every sacrifice, every regret, every year of wondering what might have been. The music became something more than notes on a page. It became a story. Her story. The audience was completely silent now. Everyone was watching. She could feel their attention like a physical weight. She saw David in the back. His champagne glass was frozen in the air. His mouth was slightly open. He was staring at her like he'd never seen her before. The piece built to its climax. The thundering chords faster and faster, building tension until it felt like the room might explode. Margaret's arms ached. Her fingers were screaming, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop, and then the ending. The final chords, massive and definitive. She brought her hands down with all the strength she had left. The last note rang out in the silent hall. Margaret lifted her hands from the keys and sat very still. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was frozen. Then someone started clapping. Then another person. Then the whole room erupted. People were standing. They were cheering. Some were actually shouting. It was the kind of applause usually reserved for concert halls, not community center galas. Margaret stood slowly, her legs shaking. She gave a small bow, overwhelmed by the response. Her eyes found David in the crowd. He was clapping too. But his face was pale. He looked shocked, confused, like his entire understanding of the world had just been turned upside down. And Margaret, standing at the piano with her simple black dress and her ordinary life, felt something she hadn't felt in 30 years. She felt like herself again. The applause went on for what felt like forever. Margaret stood by the piano, not quite believing what had just happened. Her hands were still shaking. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Linda rushed onto the stage and hugged her tight. That was incredible, she whispered. Absolutely incredible. People were coming up to the stage now. Donors, guests, strangers, all of them wanting to shake her hand, to tell her how moved they were. Margaret smiled and thanked them, but it all felt like a dream, like it was happening to someone else. Through the crowd, she saw David. He was standing at the back of the room, still holding his champagne glass. He wasn't moving. He was just staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Eventually, the crowd thinned. The master of ceremonies announced that the evening would continue, that there would be more music and dancing later. People went back to their tables, back to their conversations, but they kept glancing at Margaret, pointing, whispering. She slipped away to the practice room, needing a moment to breathe. She sat on the bench and put her head in her hands. Her whole body was trembling now that the adrenaline was wearing off. There was a knock on the door. "Come in," she said, expecting Linda, but it was David who entered. He closed the door behind him and stood there awkwardly, like he wasn't sure what to do with his hands. "That was remarkable," he said finally. His voice was quiet, different from before. "Thank you," Margaret said. "I had no idea." He shook his head. "When Linda said you'd won youth competitions, I thought. I don't know what I thought. Something small, local. Nothing like what I just witnessed." Margaret didn't say anything. She was too tired to be gracious, too wrung out to make this easy for him. David moved closer, then stopped. "I need to apologize. The way I spoke to you last week, and again when Linda suggested you play, I was condescending and dismissive. I made assumptions about you based on nothing. On your clothes and your job and the fact that you weren't part of the music world I know." He paused. "I was wrong. Completely wrong." "Yes," Margaret said simply. "You were." He flinched slightly but nodded. "Can I ask you something? That piece you just played, that's not something you learn in a few days. Where did you study? Who was your teacher?" "Professor James Hendricks," Margaret said. "Do you know him?" David's eyes widened. "Of course I know him. He taught at the conservatory for 30 years. He trained some of the best pianists in the country." He sat down in a chair across from her. "You studied with Hendricks?" "From when I was 12 until I was 19. "And then what happened? Why aren't you performing? Why is this the first time I've heard your name?" Margaret looked at him for a long moment. She could brush him off, give him a vague answer and leave, but something in his face made her tell the truth. "My father had a stroke," she said. "Right after I got accepted to the conservatory, full scholarship. It was everything I'd worked for. But someone had to take care of the family. Someone had to work. I was the oldest. So I did." David was quiet for a long time. "You gave it up." The conservatory. The music, everything. Yes, for 30 years. Yes, he rubbed his face with both hands. I don't know what to say. That's an incredible sacrifice. It's what families do, Margaret said. You take care of each other. But your talent, your gift, didn't it kill you to walk away from it? Margaret thought about that. For a long time, yes. It hurt too much to even think about. So I didn't. I packed everything away and tried to pretend it had never existed. She looked down at her hands. But I guess some things don't stay buried. Why did you come back to it now? David asked. After all this time? Margaret smiled, and there was an edge to it. Honestly? Because you made me angry, he blinked. I did? That first day when you assumed I couldn't understand music. And then last week when you made it clear you didn't think I belonged on the same stage as you. She met his eyes. You weren't wrong to doubt me. I hadn't played seriously in 3 decades. But your certainty that I was beneath you, that I couldn't possibly have anything to offer, that bothered me. David looked down. I deserved that. You did, she agreed. He was quiet for another moment. Then he looked up and his expression had changed. There was something determined in his eyes now. I want to make this right. I run a foundation, the Morrison Music Foundation. We provide funding for music education, scholarships for talented students, performance opportunities for emerging artists. He leaned forward. I'd like to arrange a recital for you. A proper one at our concert hall. All proceeds could go to a charity of your choice. Margaret shook her head. I don't think so. Why not? You're extraordinary. People deserve to hear you play. Because I'm not a performer anymore, Margaret said. I'm a hospital administrator. That performance out there, that was something I needed to do for myself. To prove that I still could. But it's not my life now. But it could be, David insisted. You still have the gift. You proved that tonight. Having the gift and building a career are 2 different things, Margaret said. I'm 52 years old. I'd be starting from nothing. And honestly, I'm not sure I want that life anymore. I'm not sure I ever really wanted it. David looked confused. What do you mean? You were going to the conservatory. Because that's what you did if you were good at piano, Margaret said. That was the path. Study, compete, perform. But I was 19. I never stopped to ask myself if that was what I actually wanted, or if it was just what everyone expected. She stood up and walked to the window. Maybe losing it was the worst thing that ever happened to me, or maybe it saved me from a life that wouldn't have made me happy. I'll never know. So what will you do now? David asked. Margaret turned to look at him. I'll keep playing. For myself? For the joy of it. That's enough, she paused. But there is something you could help me with if you're serious about making amends. Anything, David said. My hospital has a patient care fund for families who can't afford treatment, for people who are choosing between medicine and rent. She thought of her father all those years ago. One recital like you suggested, but I'd want all the proceeds to go there. David stood up. Done, we'll make it happen. He held out his hand. Partners, Margaret shook it. Partners. Over the next few weeks, David was true to his word. He arranged everything. A date at the Foundation's concert hall. Publicity, ticket sales. Margaret practiced when she could, fitting it around her job and her life. The night of the recital came. The hall was smaller than Margaret expected, more intimate. But it was beautiful with perfect acoustics and a gorgeous Steinway on stage. Her family was there in the front row. Her mother, who cried through the entire performance. Her sister and brother, who had never understood what she'd given up until now. Her niece, who looked at her with new eyes, seeing her aunt as more than just the practical woman who organized family dinners. Margaret played everything. The Chopin Nocturne, the Rachmaninoff Prelude, other pieces she'd rediscovered in her practice. And when she finished, when the last note faded away, she looked out at the audience and felt complete. Not because she'd proven herself, not because she'd impressed anyone, but because she'd found her way back to something she loved, on her own terms. After the performance, people lined up to congratulate her. Donors wrote checks for the hospital fund. Local music teachers asked if she'd consider giving lessons. David stood at the back watching with a smile. But the moment that mattered most came later when everyone had left. Margaret was packing up her sheet music when her mother came backstage. I never knew, her mother said, her voice breaking. I never knew what you gave up for us. Your father and we thought you'd just changed your mind about the conservatory, that you'd decided you wanted something else. I know, Mom, Margaret said gently. If we'd known, we would have found another way. We wouldn't have let you sacrifice your dreams. Margaret took her mother's hands. I know that too. But it's okay, really, I don't regret it. How can you not regret it? Her mother asked. You lost 30 years? I didn't lose them, Margaret said. I lived them. I helped Dad recover. I made sure you guys were okay. I built a career I'm proud of. Those years weren't wasted just because I wasn't playing piano. But you could have been famous. You could have been like him. She nodded toward where David had been standing. Margaret smiled. Maybe. Or maybe I would have burned out. Maybe I would have hated the pressure and the competition and the constant travel. Maybe I would have been miserable. She picked up her sheet music. I got to come back to music when I was ready. When I could appreciate it for what it is, not what it could get me. That's a gift too. Her mother hugged her tight. You're a better person than I am. I'm just a person, Mom, trying to figure it out like everyone else. A month later, Margaret stood in the hospital chapel. It was quiet, empty. The old piano in the corner had been tuned recently, thanks to a donation from the Morrison Foundation. She sat down and started to play. Nothing fancy. Just simple melodies. Music for healing, for comfort. A nurse poked her head in. Is that you playing? It's beautiful. Thanks, Margaret said. We've been hearing it all week. During lunch breaks. The patients love it, Margaret smiled. Good. That's why I'm here. The nurse left and Margaret kept playing. Outside the chapel, the hospital continued its work. People were being born, being healed, saying goodbye. The full cycle of life happening all around her. And in the middle of it all, Margaret played her piano. Not for fame, not for recognition, but because the music was part of her, and she was finally brave enough to let it out. She'd thought David Morrison had looked down on her that first day because she seemed ordinary. And maybe he had, but she'd learned something important. Ordinary lives could hold extraordinary gifts. Quiet sacrifices could be as meaningful as public triumphs, and sometimes the longest way around was the only way home. Her fingers moved across the keys, playing a simple melody. Nothing complex, nothing that would win competitions. Just honest music, made with hands that had finally found their way back to where they belonged.